o'clock. Thanks so much, Kagisa, for recording. Okay, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this RETIG webinar. My name is Leanne Brown, and I am the current chairperson of RETIG. And I'm sure most of you know, but in case you don't, RETIG stands for the Research, Education and Training Interest Group of LIASA. So this is our third webinar for the year, and the theme for today's webinar is citation pollution and predatory or questionable publishing practices. All of us here, whether we librarians, researchers, or academics, have been confronted with the scourge of predatory journals, and the number of such publications seems to increase from day to day. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today, and I hope you enjoy this webinar, which promises to be informative, interesting, and valuable to all of us. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available to everyone soon after the event. So if you miss any part of it or you want to share it with your colleagues, it will be available after the event. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the RETIG chair-elect, who is Mr. Marupeni Ramabina, and he's going to introduce our speaker today. So Marupeni, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon. Marupeni Ramabina from University of Venda Library here in Limpopo province. As the Chairperson said, I'm one of the EXCO members of our interest group. Our speaker for today is Mr. Wynand van der Walt, who is a Senior Manager, Innovation Systems and Collections at the Rhodes University Library in the Eastern Cape. He holds a master's degree in IT from the University of Pretoria and is currently enrolled for PhD at KU Leuven University in Belgium. His areas of interest are leadership for innovation, digitization, digital curation, and scholarly communication, and also the semantic web and how it affects library-related technologies. Wynand, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Marupeni, and thank you all the colleagues for joining, and I see more people are joining as we are talking. I just have to say this, I'm looking at pictures of colleagues that I've known for a very long time, and they all look very young still. I don't look that young anymore, so I'm going to switch off my video quite soon and rather have you focus on the presentation. I think we've got about an hour, 40 minutes to an hour, I think, for presentation, and then also time for questions. But just to say that afterwards, you can also send questions if you have. So I'm just going to switch off my video, stop video, and then I'm going to share my screen. Just hold on a second, please. I need to share correctly. And can somebody confirm that they can see the presentation?
Yes, all good.
Great, thank you. I should have started off by saying Happy Africa Day. And I think from 2 weeks ago, I was in a conversation for a week-long conversation regarding research in Africa. And I know that what I'm talking to you about today actually also impacts on African scholars and African scholarly institutions, more so, I think, than our northern counterparts, because of the kind of challenges that we have with in terms of bias, etc., within the scholarly communication ecosystem. But I'm not going to focus on that today. And, oh, sorry, just to say also, please, you can also type questions. I can't see the questions in the chat box, or remarks you want to add into the chat box. That's fine. It's being monitored, and most welcome to stop in any time if something is not clear to you. All right. First of all, I have to say that this is my supervisor, Professor Kirsten Kraus. He's at Genisa School of Computing. He's one of my supervisors, but we are research partners in citation pollution and impact it has on scholarly communication and integrity within scholarly environment. So some of you might know him. Some of you would have seen him last week at the WWIS webinar, which I unfortunately could not attend. And he's also one of the leading scholars currently in the field of citation pollution, and we work closely together. So a lot of thanks I have to give to Prof. Kirsten Kraus. Right, in terms of what we are going to talk about today, well, this workshop provides, first of all, background to citation pollution, its effect on scholarly integrity and scholarly reputations, and also allowing an opportunity to reflect on how do we distinguish between questionable and legitimate science, and potentially also which tools are available then to assist with the process. And I want us to reflect on this, and I've looked at the attendees list, and some of us are librarians, some support research differently than other librarians. I see there's also some vendors, and also even SANDIC representation. So we come from different backgrounds, yet I think it's a similar kind of a state of reflection or introspection that we have to do, how each of us can then strategize and think how we can position ourselves better to support integrity within the scholarly ecosystem. So what's the base question that we're really talking about? Well, it's all about reputational reputation management, reputational risk management. As a scholar, what is your reputation as a scholar worth to you? What is your institutional scholarly reputation worth? How do we, as research librarians and research support units, support scholarly rigor? And what is our role in reputational risk management? And potentially as a publisher or vendor, what is reputation worth to you? Because a reputation cannot be equated in terms of, what's the rand value, rather the loss. One can consider the fact that if Rhodes, as the institution I work for, if our scholarly integrity is not intact anymore and we are being questioned, can you imagine the kind of devastation this will have on the scholars at Rhodes, their research being questioned, and also funding, for instance. But I will talk about the implications of scholarly, of citation pollution further down the line as well. Just consider these questions as we go through the presentation. So the bottom line is, what is the difference between questionable and legitimate science? What is citation pollution? The effect it has? What can we as academics do? Academic librarians do? And which tools are currently available to assist? All right. So first of all, questionable science. We talk about citation pollution. So with any kind of pollution, it means that something has infiltrated and unfortunately created an impure environment, whether it's water pollution, air pollution, etc. We now have citation pollution. But one has to then ask, all right, what is coming in? What's infiltrating and causing damage to the purity or the integrity of the environment? Well, there's different types of questionable science. First of all, there's articles published in predatory journals, which we will reflect on as well. There's a lot of retracted research actually infiltrating legitimate science, causing citation pollution. But citation pollution in itself is also becoming a challenge because you've got different generations of citation pollution, with each generation building on the previous generation. And there's also a lot of unidentified, or what we refer to as bad science, out there. And that's most probably the most difficult one to ascertain, because we haven't identified it. And until it's identified, for instance, if an article is out there, but it's in valid study and it should be retracted, but it hasn't retracted yet, what kind of impact does it might it have on your research? And then also just weak or low quality science. So those are the questionable science types that we've identified. And then we look at the opposite. Well, what's legitimate science? Well, any science, scholarly process that adheres to best scholarly practices. But there's a variance degree of how this impacts. And I want to specifically talk about journal vetting and reputational risk, obviously, and I will talk about vetting a bit more down the line as well. The greater the vetting, the less risk associated with reputational damage. The less vetting, and this might be not just journal vetting, but journal vetting encompasses, for instance, the the scholarly ethics, the publishing ethics, etc. So there's a number of things that it encompasses when we just speak about journal vetting. But the less effort is put into journal vetting or article scholarly integrity processes, the more the risk is increased. And that's just not just the scholar's reputation, as I've already indicated. It's way more than just a single scholar. We also know there's other factors involved, and unfortunately, the scholarly ecosystem is not an equal society at this point in time, and we are aware of quite a number of behaviors within a scholarly environment, some unknowingly, but some forced due to circumstances that unfortunately also adds to this imbalance within the continuum and causing great or increasing reputational risk. So let's go to citation pollution. And for lack of a good, in my view, a good definition, I've sat with a number of scholars, and we've come up with a sort of a more better definition, or what we refer to as a better definition of what citation pollution actually is. But it's the result of citation behaviors, where scholars, whether they know it or not, cite low quality or pseudoscientific materials as part of their scholarly creation and communication processes, and then in turn, how these scholarly outputs are actually disseminated within the scholarly ecosystem. And I think what I would like to say immediately at this point in time is that I've been a librarian for more than 30 years. And it's only recently that I really thought about citation behaviors and really asking questions like, why do people cite what they cite? And also, a lot of the citation behavior frameworks were developed, well, I think all of them were developed pre-internet era. So the research process and the rigor that the researchers did back then in terms of finding information sources is slightly different in today's environment. Today, quite easily, we can come up with a theory, and then we can find articles to cite, to back our theory, instead of only creating that theory once we've assessed all of the materials available to us. But there's just too many materials available. So at this point in time, we know that entire fields of scientific research are susceptible to pollution of the literature by unverified research or even fake articles published in fake journals, and how this is incorporated into legitimate meta-analysis. So what's the impact? It's actually quite devastating if you consider all these items I'm going to speak to. First of all, it can corrupt academic evaluation systems. And I want us to reflect on how do we, what's academic evaluation system within the South African context? And it will only take one article submitted to a predatory journal for a scholar to lose his academic rating or ranking. And also, and quite often, those researchers unknowingly actually build academic reputations based on questionable publications, which is also scary to think about. Our scholars receive recognition or are promoted or remunerated based on articles published. Yet, some of it might be published in questionable outlets. What will happen then to the scholar? To the recognition is reserved, can be withdrawn, promotions can be withdrawn, and even remuneration can be withdrawn. Predatory journals can also be used to inflate the researcher's Google Scholar citation metrics and H-index. Accreditation bodies are influenced and misled through these processes. Questionable science can damage the professional standing, ranking, and reputation of universities. And I think I want to make this clear from the start. As researchers, or researchers don't work in isolation. They also represent the institution, and it will only take one scholar within a specific discipline, for argument's sake, at the institution, that can bring the whole university into dispute. Questionable science can distort public discourse, and we've actually seen this during the COVID period, the COVID race, we refer to it, where a lot of the public discourse was based on questionable science, to such an extent that even a part of the legislation that came into being within, I think it was United States legislation, was actually based on a questionable publication. So one can understand the dire repercussions of this. Questionable science and citation pollution can lead to the wastage of resources. That's quite obvious. Can you imagine spending 2-3 years on doing research only to find the research nullified or having to be retracted in the future? But also, I think what's a real critical issue for us is questionable science can lead to retraction or discontinuance of funding opportunities, not just for a research entity, but also for the research itself. I would not want, if I were to be a funder, I would want to know that my funding goes to a scholar of good standing and that follows all the right processes. All right, this is just an image which I absolutely love, and this actually was the infodemic curve during the COVID era, but it's the same principle. And I actually want to, how can I can't actually show you with my pointer, mouse pointer, but on your left, you've got only 3 lines, 2 red, 1 orange, then the next one multiplies, it multiplies until the 4th and the 5th generation. Now, each of those segments we refer to as a generation. It only takes one bad scientific output to actually influence, for argument's sake, in this case, 1 led to the, or influence 2, and those then become untrustworthy articles in turn, which again in turn was cited, etc., etc. And the bottom line is, do you trust your sources? And how can we stop it? How can we stop this infodemic from occurring? This was an infodemic in terms of COVID, but it actually goes for all science. And it's sort of on a similar process like gossip or rumors. Right. We also need to reflect on journalists and journal vetting. And this is a very interesting area. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into great detail. This is a key aspect of what I'm actually looking at in my doctoral studies. But we know in South African context, we have the DET lists, or DET accreditation list that we have to consider when we want to publish. However, we also know that there's some challenges pertaining to journalists. So I started about 3 years ago, and I did an audit, and I did it on behalf of Fidelio at that point in time. I'm an advisor. Sorry, I should have said this from the start. I'm an advisory board member for Fidelio, and you might hear about Fidelio a lot more in the future. I've been an advisory board member for about 2.5 years already. It's an Irish-based company that actually wants to address this very issue. So part of the audit I did back then indicated there's more than 400 journalists available. And I don't think I've even gotten all of them. It's not a comprehensive list. And one can say, well, DET is only one of them. We also know that DET would include, for instance, other lists beyond their own individual individual titles that they've listed. So having 400 plus journals, journalists, one should ask, but why? What's behind this? What is so different from one list to another? So there's different types. First of all, you get your journal blacklist, and it's more common actually not to refer to journal blacklists anymore, but rather to a journal. What's the right term? It's not blacklist. It's questionable lists, if I remember correctly. But I think they're trying to find a better term than just blacklist because of the negative connotation it has. Some of these are just some of the examples. Stop predatory journals, cabals, Beals. Beals has been discontinued, has been incorporated into cabals. The Iranian journal blacklist, which has subsequently disappeared. Fortunately, we made a copy of it and we still have it. Malaysian blacklist, and the list goes on. However, as with many things in life, you know, it's good and fair to say, well, this is what you should not do. In this case, do not publish in these journals, or do not cite an article that's in one of these journals. But that's actually the wrong way to look at it, because whose criteria is being applied to determine whether something is not good or good. And for those of you who know Beals' list, there was a lot of discussions around Beals where he was objective. It came out, I mean, afterwards it came out quite strongly that he was actually not happy with the open access movement and felt that most of the open access journals out there was actually questionable. We also know, unfortunately, that the very open access environment was what obviously just created this incredible fertile environment for this kind of behaviors to come forth. Then there's quite a number of vetted or credited or proved lists, number of indices, organizational vetted lists, institutional vetted lists, research entity vetted directories, and the list continues. But what I'm busy with currently, and this just besides this, I'm going through all these lists, but I'm looking at the vetting criteria being applied to see what is the commonalities in the vetting criteria, and then why then should we have all these diverse lists instead of more common lists that one can use. But there's also problems with these vetted lists. Just to point out, well, what does vetting mean? Well, first of all, there's a journal assessment process. And the journal assessment process looks at scientific rigor, you know, if argument's sake, peer review, double-blind peer review, etc. Is the journal affiliated to a specific organization? Who's serving on the editorial board? What's the impact factor? What business model is applied? And where's this journal, for instance, indexed? And indexing is obviously an expression of assessment, because in order to be included in an index, you are actually assessed, as most of you must probably know. But there's also vetting principles. There's compliance to a set of criteria. Currently, you'll find there's like the principle of transparency and best practice that you'll find in editorial forums like WAME, which I can't remember what it stands for anymore. There's also membership that you can apply with OASPER, COPE, etc. And again, part of my study is to reflect on why do we have different, like in this instance, what's the difference between COPE and OASPER in terms of their criteria or the principles that they apply and they then use to vet journals. Then there's journal review processes that one can assess, like the policy statement in terms of ethics, it's technical, administrative. It's quite a long list actually. And there's also, unfortunately, a reliance on renowned index providers. Not I've got anything against them. Clarivet Analytics, Elsevier, etc. There's an immense reliance on them, but we also know that even those indices have been infiltrated with specifically through pseudoscience journals. Jan Maton in 2020 or 2021 said that DHET trusts international lists to exercise sufficient internal quality checks to ensure that the journals included in their lists comply with the highest standards of editorial quality integrity. And I think that is it's a very utopian kind of approach to it. However, he also said, it is now well documented that the international journal indices and lists do not, in fact, exercise sufficient quality controls. And there's sufficient evidence in the literature to point to this, where indices have been checked and you would pick up predatory materials, for instance, being included in the index. And it goes for each and every index, but I will, that's also, again, something else that I can talk to at a later stage. So what's the issues with these lists and the list data and the metadata? Well, first of all, what we've picked up is this complete incompatibility between lists. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, one can understand if we talk about scholarly communication and supporting the scholarly communication processes, we need to understand the scholarly environment, first of all, and also then why do we have these lists and which lists are applicable to our environment. And what we realize is this incompatibility between these lists. And these lists are incredibly dispersed within the scholarly ecosystem. There's also incredible lack of openness or clarity on metadata and metadata standards within lists. What is interesting, and I've done this with only one list, if I were to take the same criteria that a list owner, I won't name, I'm not going to name the list owner's name. If I took the same criteria that they want to apply to journals for inclusion in their list and applied it to the list itself, they would have failed miserably. As just one of the things, I think, in terms of openness and clarity. But specifically, we also focus on metadata and metadata standards. There's also non-compliance and or non-expression of standards used. There's limited data harmonization integration. There's incredible mistakes in this. I cannot even begin to, and the DIET is most probably, I sure hope there's nobody from DIET on this group today, but the DIET list itself, the individual titles, are most probably one of the worst lists I've ever come across. There's also a lot of weak or no search functionality within this list. There's no cross-list search functionality where multiple lists are available. When we look at the metadata quality, we picked up there's vast difference between list providers, and there's also obviously there's different levels of metadata, the list compiler, provider metadata versus the journal title metadata versus the publisher metadata. And then we started asking questions. All right, but who's providing the list? What is the purpose of the list? Which criteria is being applied? Where's the information acquired from? And how often is it checked and updated? Some of these lists are actually, vetted lists. They differ in terms of when they're updated, who checks them, who actually audits them. Apologies. And we know that like DIET is an annual list. We know a lot of the continual lists, like your major indices, but we also know some of these lists are only like every 3 years or every 5 years. And what goes on behind the scenes during those years that there's no list provided towards the upcoming list. So quite a number. I mean, it's fascinating actually to venture into this field. Certain common challenges: lacking or incomplete metadata. There's a lot of alternative titles. There's a lot of ISSNs out there. Name changes. I want to cry if I see name changes. Some should change their name, but some journals have actually changed. Apologies. Some journals have changed the name to something that it was previously. And as you can see there, American Journal of Diseases of Children, it was actually the title from 1911 to 1950, and again from 1960 to 1993. Apologies, I actually have a cold. And the more I speak, I feel my throat actually getting worse. There's also a lot of incorrect metadata, mistakes are found, parallel titles and alternative titles on lists, especially in non-English versions. The authoritative forms of titles and historical title data just not being there. Specifically in terms of historical title data, in order to verify if a journal was vetted at a certain point in time, one needs to understand historical title changes. Yet, I find a lot of lists that would say, this journal has been indexed since 1910 or something like that. That journal title did not exist back then. It existed in a different form with a different ISSN. Apologies, I just need to get water. Just hold on a second, please. Apologies, I've asked one of my colleagues to go and just fetch water for me. I was slightly ill-prepared. All right. Right. So what are the bad practices that we need to stop doing? And I'm glad there's a number of Savinet staff members here. This title, Journal of Contemporary Management, is, I've taken this snippet from Savinet, and I'm sorry, I've not cited it correctly. Apologies. I think you'll just have to give me 30 seconds, please. I do apologize for this. But you're welcome to ask questions or anything in the meantime. I'm just going to step out for a second.
Hi, colleagues. Just a reminder that you can send your questions on the chat if you have any questions, and then we'll deal with the questions at the end of the session. Thank you, colleagues.
Right, I'm back. I've got some water, and I do apologize for this. This title, Journal of Contemporary Management, is accredited by DIET. It is accessible via Sabinet's platforms. If it's cited, who would know which journal is actually cited? Because this is exactly the same journal elsewhere. This is a Journal of Contemporary Management, same title, different ISSN. That's available. I think this was in Canada, if I remember correctly. Where do we reference? We don't reference ISSNs. Fortunately, nowadays, it becomes the practice to actually include the DOI in references. And that's normally, well, sometimes the only lead you get to be able to assess immediately whether this is the right journal being cited. And also for a person within their field who would know their journals, it will be easy to reflect. Sorry, on whether this is a correct journal or not. However, if somebody in management said, oh, Journal of Contemporary Management, yes, I know it. It's on DIET's list, but it might be the wrong one. It might be a hijacked journal, like in this case. At the bottom, you can also see the ridiculousness of the inclusion of where this journal is being indexed. Bell's directories, e-journals, Google Scholar, PKP Open Journal System, which is not even an index, and Wanfang data, which I have no clue as to what it actually is. But that's a kind of evidence you can immediately pick up something is wrong when you look at this. One of my colleagues brought me a eucalyptus strepsil, so I should be fine quite soon. Then there's some other bad practices, like in this case, Academic Research Centre of Canada. Sorry, no, not Academic Research Centre of Canada, but the ISI. And for a lot of us, ISI actually means ISI Web of Science. But if you click on this, you can clearly see this is not ISI Web of Science. This is different. So even at that level, there's some behaviors that's quite questionable. And this is just the example of ISI. If you actually click on it now, it's definitely not Web of Science, ISI the way we knew it. But looking at the alternative, what's the best practice? When it comes to best practice, one should consider a number of things. From an academic librarian perspective, what is the first thing we need to do? We need to reflect on citation behaviors and citation patterns. And this for me was a personal challenge because I thought, you know, you've been a librarian for 30 years. But what is citation behaviors? And I had to go back to the literature to find out exactly what is meant by this. What, no, sorry, what were the various frameworks applied in this case? I also think that we need to reflect on scholarly support rendered to the scholarly community. And that's quite difficult because we even at Rhodes, we have a scholar librarian position. We've got a digital scholarship unit. But what is really meant by a scholar librarian postal unit? And what is meant by a digital scholarship postal unit? And do they differ between institutions? Because I think one of the things that we have found a challenge currently is that even our different academic libraries support their scholars differently. And I have not seen yet that we've come across a community of practice. And I think this is one of the outcomes of this. I would very much like to see community of practice being established for scholar librarians, digital scholarship librarians, to actually talk to each other and create a best practice that all of us can actually work towards in a South African context. We also need to reflect on possible actions that can be taken in terms of which journals are being made accessible at your library. And Leanne, I did not intend to do this on purpose, but we had a look at UNISA on the OPAC, and we immediately picked up that one of those global media journal entries is actually a predatory journal. And I promise you, it's all of us. It's not just limited to UNISA. How do we support emerging and established scholars with citation behaviors? First of all, we need to understand why researchers cite what they cite. We also need to make sure that the referencing techniques are being adhered to and which referencing tools are made available to them. But we also need to understand that we can't always rely on the referencing tool to fix references. I've done quite a number of audits over the past 2 years of various articles. And one of the things that I picked up is that there's an immense amount of human error being made in citations. And by established scholars, I'm not even talking about emerging scholars, by established scholars, to such an extent that there's, I mean, one, we couldn't even pick up what is being referenced. Yet, if I can pick it up as a librarian, should the publisher not have picked it up? The peer review process. But quite often, I think people don't consider a reference list as a key indicator of scholarly integrity. They would focus very much on the writing style or, the content of the article, whether there's the process, due diligence process have been followed, etc., but not considering the actual references as an indicator. We should consider checking reference lists on behalf of scholars. I don't know whether we have the staffing to do so. But we should possibly look at articles, preferably before publication, to assist, if anything from our side can be done, to remove journals. And I think part of the due diligence process, specifically for pre-publication, is important to identify those articles that was potentially pseudoscientific or published in predatory journals and remove them, but also consider what is the impact of inclusion or exclusion. We know that there's differences in citation impact levels, meaning that I might have cited an article in a predatory journal I'm really sorry. I was fine until about 5 minutes before I had this presentation. Where was I? Oh, yes. An article might have been, oh, apologies. An article might have been cited, but there might be another 4 or 5 articles cited that support that specific theory or support the inclusion of that statement in your research. But we've also realized sometimes some of these citations are actually more creates a level of vulnerability to the whole integrity, meaning that a key theory was taken from a predatory journal or retracted item and then used as a for instance, a framework within an article, meaning that there's different levels of impact that you might find in terms of the article. Now, one would assume that the articles that you have in your reference list are those that have shaped your knowledge when it comes to your creation, and the article, the output, the scholarly output being your creation. But quite often nowadays, we see that's not the case because of the vast amount of information being available. Therefore, it's not always easy to check whether something, what is the level of impact of something that should not have been cited or included in the citation list. Let me rather word it that way. So I think it's important for librarians to actually look at articles before publication. And we can even consider following the due diligence process on their behalf. However, this is also tricky because we need to be on par with the kind of scholarly due diligence process that's required from a scholar. So we as librarians need to obviously increase our capacity and knowledge in this regard. Then we need to reflect on possible actions been there. How do you support publishing initiatives within your institution? A number of our institutions are actually also publishers. At Rhodes, we have Open Journal System, and we publish a DET accredited journal. So now the role is changing slightly. So it's not about a librarian now assisting a scholar, but now it's a librarian or library assisting the publishing unit on campus. One of the areas that's of great concern as well is it will take one article to be retracted to bring down the reputation of a journal. I could set if you Lancet or one of those. And I'll tell you about Lancet in a minute or two. All right. And then also, what's the quality of metadata on these publishing platforms? Which is also because we talked about transparency. We talked about the criteria, etc. But are those data elements actually visible on the publishing platform? So one of the things I want us to do as librarians is actually go back to our institutions and look at our publishing platforms to see if all the information is there that should be there. This is a good example. And this is HTS Theological Studies, which I think is a Sun Scholar, if I remember correctly, where all the information is clearly visible on the platform pertaining to all aspects of the journal, including its history. Also, the standards and code of practices that's being adhered to, and that's normally expressed through a membership statement. This case is ACES. ACES is a member who subscribes to the standards and code of practice of several leading industry organizations, including DOAJ, Authenticate, etc., etc. Right. Apologies. The screen that you have in front of you, I just want to show you the bottom part. First, Psychoanalytical Practice, which formerly was Psychoanalytical Psychotherapy in South Africa, which changed its name, I think it was middle of last year, without anybody knowing until the issue came out. And how does this impact on the journal list itself, and how do then you express it? And that's just an example above in terms of the kind of quality of metadata that one would expect from a list. All right, so what's the way forward? Well, first of all, I think we have to consider ourselves as librarians or publishers that we are part of a larger ecosystem. And we have to collaborate, and we have to think of a new level of collaboration. And we have to take quality assurance to a new level. And I think librarians have got a great role to play in this. So there's a lot of things. We can focus on metadata, data harmonization, data integration, because the more data is available about an object, the more transparent that object becomes to its consumers. And also realizing that the number of role players in the ecosystem is actually vast. I mean, the direct stakeholders would be obviously your scholars, research institutions, etc. There's an opportunity within this ecosystem because the challenge of scholarly integrity is quite know now. So there's an opportunity for us to work together collaboratively, look at what tools are available and what's a potential return on investment, and how does that actually impact on to transform our societies. And in this case, this is through the society being the research ecosystem, and then obviously that has its repercussions as well within the broader society. So, actions. Well, first of all, we need to engage with all stakeholders. Publishers and journal hosts, we need to ensure that journal titles are unique. This is something that I've come across often, that I find horrific, that journal titles are not unique, therefore it can create ambiguity, and it leads to often misrepresentation. I would not want to publish a journal knowing that a similar title has been published elsewhere, because if they do something wrong, I might be actually impacted by it, considering that we share a name in terms of a journal. We have to ensure that identifiers have been registered and correctly. We have to check for data. When changing titles, please also change the ISSN. So you can see why I'm now actually speaking to publishers and journal hosts. Please change the ISSN as well. Registering for DOIs at the journal title level. A lot of our libraries and our publishing units on campuses only register DOIs at the article level and not at the journal level, which is also unfortunately problematic when doing assessments. When articles are retracted, do not delete objects, as this adds to link rot. Rather, just make a clear statement to say this has been retracted. And I'll mention Retraction Watch just now as well. Ensure that bibliographic level metadata is part of the open science movement. So open science is not just about the product, but also about the metadata surrounding the product that needs to be actually accessible. For list owners and compilers, check your data for correctness, for completeness. Provide clear set of criteria for reasons for inclusion and exclusion. Use standard formats for expressing reasons for inclusion or exclusion. We find this also very interesting. Dear AJ would say, discontinue title because not adhering to best practice, for argument's sake. Another instance might be, dear AJ retracted, sorry, not retracted, dear AJ discontinued inclusion, but it might be for a very legitimate reason. The Directive of Open Access Journals focuses on open access journals. If a journal decided to move from open access to a paywall environment or business model, then it's a valid reason. It's not a reason for concern within a scholarly environment. It's a valid reason, but it needs to be stipulated as such. Apologies. I've seen lists where I just change the titles on the list and rather redirect. I wish they would rather redirect to a new bibliographic entry for their journal, and also provide journal status, for example, currently known as seized, etc., which I call the C status. Engaging with academics. One thing that we can really assist them with is to triple check the references. Apologies. Human error is one of the biggest reasons for challenges within identifying or ascertaining the correctness of materials being cited, and which further unfortunately adds to citation pollution. Inability or difficulty to assess impact of an article if there's a incorrect reference, or there's inability or difficulty to cross-link between disparate systems when citations were not done correctly. I would argue that we start a movement, and I've tried this myself, to always include persistent identifiers in all references, as persistent identifiers, apologies, are often a unique identifier for that article and journal. And follow scholarly due diligence. So what is scholarly due diligence? there's a number of things to consider during scholarly due diligence. Apologies, there's an announcement over the intercom system at our library. It should be over in a second. All right. Scholarly due diligence is the due diligence required by any scholar to actually ascertain the correctness of the inclusion and exclusion of items that shaped their thinking and obviously the expression thereof within this product. One of the greatest areas of concern currently is that we do not consider Retraction Watch as a key tool. And if you go to Retraction Watch, you'll even find that some of the articles published in very prestigious journals like Lancet has been retracted. So just focusing on a journal title is not enough. You need to make sure that that article has not been retracted. And there might be very good reasons for a retraction. There's apologies. One of the reasons being obviously that there's been inconsistency with ethics. We've seen metadata, sorry, not metadata, raw data being manipulated, and that has been retracted. So that's why it's also important nowadays to also make sure that the raw data of any article is actually made accessible, because that's part of a public peer review system. If it can be replicated elsewhere, then it adds value and it adds, it approves. It's a stamp of approval in terms of the scholarly integrity that was followed previously. But Retraction Watch is critical as a tool in the due diligence process. Another option is Fidelio itself, and I think I've mentioned that I am on Fidelio's board as well, and they are busy compiling a due diligence checklist, and also a number of other due diligence processes you can follow in terms of repeatable titles, high-risk titles, journal checklists, etc. And I think that should be made available quite soon. So there's something to look forward to. But the bottom line again is, do you trust your sources? The one good thing stemming from the COVID-19 race was that we picked up that the scientific community is doing better at correcting itself. And it's correcting itself through portals like Retraction Watch to say, you know what, this was a mistake, it should not continue. Retract that article, but please don't cite it going forward. However, we picked up that things get cited. There's a lot of studies nowadays done with the citation pollution, and you can actually track to what extent things have just escalated beyond belief. Post-publication reviews are flourishing, and maybe this should become the norm. And also there's an emerging awareness and accountability within the scholarly community, which led to critical retractions, withdrawals, and corrections, which I think is also a good option. It's not just to retract something, but say, right, we've picked up this an error, let us correct it. That's another thing that happened in the publishing environment, which I'm really pleased with. However, it's currently impossible to clean up the literature. One of the things is that we need to understand why something has been retracted. Whether it was published in a predatory journal and been retracted, or whether it was falsified raw data, etc. Those reasons need to be stipulated very clearly, because it does impact the scholarly environment. And we believe one of the things that should happen is that Google Scholar should flag retractions earlier. And we should avoid link rot or reference rot. So please do not remove retracted materials, etc. And well, I think most of the retractions actually occurred after publication, which is of great concern. So you can imagine it's already out there, it's being cited, and then only it's being retracted, and yet it's not being made known that something is retracted. You'll find that publishers often on their on their pages would say, this article has been retracted, but it's 6 months or 12 months down the line, or in some cases years down the line, depending on the kind of argument for retraction that was levied, and also the kind of check that's being ensued afterwards, and even in one case a legal, waiting for a legal battle to finish. We know one thing for sure, and that is speed is the enemy of rigorous science. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm so sorry for all the coughing. I am ill, unfortunately. I wasn't as bad early on, but now is the time to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Wynand, for your wonderful presentation. And yeah, these things happen with the coughing. It's absolutely not your fault. It's yeah, you can never tell at the beginning how, you know, whether it's going to affect you or not. But you know, despite everything, it was a wonderful presentation, and I've certainly learned a lot, and it's been very insightful. Yeah, lots of us, lots to think about and consider as academic librarians and as researchers who may be publishing themselves. I'm just going to go now to the chat and look, you know, go through the questions there or the comments, and then you know, people are also welcome to Cecilia Walter. You're welcome to unmute yourself. I see your hand is up.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm working in a higher education institute which offers a range of qualifications from certificates and diplomas, from first degrees right up to doctoral degrees. Because it's small, it hasn't got such a huge budget, and my particular task is supporting researchers and masters and doctoral students. And I do quite a lot of searching on various databases. And one of my problems, and this came up earlier this week, I had found a scoping review, which I sent to a lecturer, and she came back having scrutinized it and wanted an article in the reference list, which I then went to look for, and I looked on Google Scholar and EBSCO databases and Emerald and Semantic Scholar and Core and a variety of things. And I found links to it on Google Scholar and ResearchGate. And when I looked at the links and followed through and went through to the article, I became suspicious about the publisher. And I don't want to go into specifics because I don't want to get a court case against me. But I looked very carefully at the journal webpage and did some exploration on the Directory of Open Access Journals, did searches like, is this journal predatory, and got recommendations for it and others finding it suspicious. And this particular article is the only one I can find on the topic, which is very irritating. And this leads me to another problem, which causes me great anxiety, in that I find quite a lot of the journals that I come across where I have suspicions are written by scholars in MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and some other countries. And this concerns me a great deal. I get very angry because I feel people are being abused. And I also feel that because I don't usually send them on, the articles on to the researcher concerned, I feel I'm entrenching sort of Western dominance, which is a great concern to me, because I want scholars from countries who are not represented for their scholarship to be made available. And all this checking and everything is very, very time consuming, and I sort of can't do all the detailed checking, but all this is a big concern to me. And the whole situation is so muddled and complicated. I'm sorry, this has turned into a cry from the heart, which I didn't mean it to be. I don't know whether there's anything you can advise me about.
Well, I can actually now. Thank you for your question. And I actually want to cry with you, because that's you've expressed so many of the challenges, and it's not just one challenge. There's so many challenges in the publishing industry, scholarly communications industry, that you reflected on. First of all, we are acutely aware of the bias, and how do you rectify it? I know there's some initiatives like the African Cluster for Excellence, that's trying to actually rectify exactly what you're talking about, that we as African, South American, etc. scholars are treated on the same level as our European counterparts. At the same time, we're also acutely aware of how much of our knowledge, now specifically talking about knowledge in terms of raw data and indigenous knowledge, is being exported to the North and then used within research and published in the North, and then we're not part of that research process. So those are just two examples of how I agree with you that there's incredible bias. And also, as scholars, especially emerging scholars, it is not that easy for a student from, for argument's sake, Nigeria to, at the University of Lagos, for argument's sake, to publish, because it's a requirement for their doctoral to publish an article, right? Who did they go to? Well, the A-list is definitely not going to include you. And eventually, there's a concern that, I've got to publish this because I don't have money to continue. I can't wait another year, etc., etc. So let me take the quickest path available to me, and that is, let me then publish in a predatory journal. So, and then, unfortunately, that research, which might be incredibly valid research, is lost, because who else? Well, we don't want people to cite it, but at the same time, it's actually lost to the scholarly community in terms of integrity. The good news is that there are tools being developed to address some of this, but there's also different events happening across the world. We've seen, for instance, the South American scholarly environment. They are now mass consumers of information from the North, but they don't publish in the North at all. They publish in the South, because that was an agreement, and that's what the Latin index, where the Latin index was actually born from. Sorry, I've sort of lost my track. The other day I had to say that of all the things I've lost, I miss my mind the most. And that's what I've lost this morning, is my track of thought. But there's like Fidelio, and I did not want to talk about Fidelio as the only tool. Fidelio allows you to actually submit a manuscript when it's pre or post publication, and it runs through the references, and it provides you with report, and it's a probability report based on an algorithm that we've been working on for 3 years that can actually do an audit across a number of checkpoints, and that can form the basis. It actually takes the time away from trying to go to individual titles and finding out, is this a predatory title or not. So it brings up a report to say, potentially this is questionable, and this is the reason. We've picked up that this title is in Giet, but we also picked up that it's in Beals or Cabells, etc. And you have to then go back and consider the result of this report. And I think that's also part of the due diligence process, academic due diligence. Go to each of those things that were flagged and say, right, why was this flagged? And what's the reason behind it? And that's why things like the one Journal of Contemporary Management that I showed you, it's critical. Then you go back to actual original article to say, well, did this article stem from the correct version of this journal and not the hijacked version? But there's so many challenges. I mean, we talk about hijacked journals. We've come across hijacked editorial boards. Quite recently, it came out. Well, not quite recently, but I think I think it's still going to blow up completely. But we are aware of the citation cartels. And for those of you that follow Denise Nicholson's Scholarly Horizons, what do you call it? Not a blog, but an email that comes out with a lot of information. I think that's also key to always be aware of a number of things. And the citation cartels is actually becoming a great concern, because it actually renders any impact factor based on citations useless if it's being manipulated. And we know there's a lot of questions about citation and impact factors. There goes the announcement again. Oh, I'm so sorry about this. It's gone. Great. I've asked them to actually remove the intercom from my office, but I obviously have not done that. I haven't heard the message for quite a while, and suddenly I hear it today, but maybe it might be just because I'm aware of it. Another factor that one can consider is also, how do we change our citation styles to be able to pinpoint? And like you said that you had to follow a process and had to dig quite deep in order to go back to the original article, which was obviously not even actually correct, or rather say it's not correct, but rather questionable. That's why I go for, I would rather have permanent identifiers as part of the reference. Having said that, and I think I'm glad for the question at the bottom, what is meant by persistent identifier? A DOI. I don't believe a permanent link in EBSCO or anywhere else is actually really a persistent identifier. Yes, it's persistent for a period of time. It is linked, but a DOI is a registration. That's a different kind of link. And what we found is with even the permalinks in EBSCO and elsewhere, if you include a URL in your citation, you'll find that, we've added a proxy, which will be useless to anybody outside of an institution, at least our proxy, because our proxy address overrides the domain URL. So for me, the unproxied pure DOI is possibly the only good persistent identifier to ever use. DOI being either a cross-ref DOI or a DataCite DOI. The rest I find questionable. However, where there's no DOI, then I question, well, why does this journal not register with Crossref or with one of the other groups? In as much as you would question a book not having an ISBN, why is there I mean, it sort of gives you a feeling of if a book doesn't have an ISBN, can I trust it? And then I think the same should happen when it comes to persistent identifiers, but it's not about the persistent identifier. It's a kind of identifier that we're really concerned about. A subscription to Fidelio was definitely necessary. Fidelio, I did not mean for this to go into a Fidelio discussion, but but Fidelio, two of the current services that's being rendered, and they're looking to expand the list of services. First of all, is the just a pure search box where you can type in a journal title and you can find the variations and you can see exactly where it's vetted and where it's not vetted, or where it's blacklisted, etc., or questioned. The other option is the service where you can submit a manuscript, or even a CV. If you a research office and you want to employ a researcher, you can submit a full CV and it'll check and see whether this researcher is actually a good scholar. But those are just some of the services. But I would rather suggest that you actually speak to Wiz about this. WWIS, they have taken on Fidelio as one of their key tools to fight citation pollution. Sorry, I've said a lot, but I think I've sort of responded to a number of the issues that you mentioned. Am I right?
Thank you, Vainant. Yes, I just see that there are Marupeni's got his hand up, and also before that there was someone I think Bangani. Yes, okay. If Marupeni, can you can speak?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Vainant, for the presentation. Just two quick things for me here, maybe to Vainant and everyone here. When we are talking about the low quality materials that people are referencing, what do we say about, or where do we put Wikipedia now? I see there's a lot of editing which is happening on Wikipedia now. So what do we say about that? And also to add on what Siviwe is saying in the chat, he also mentioned the issue of the thesis and dissertations, which are sitting there in the IR. Do we also consider them when we are talking about the low quality materials? The last thing from your question, Vainant, is the library involved in this process? Whose role or responsibility would that be to check if the references on this article are okay? Is it the author, maybe the publisher or the library? If it's the library, who in the library can assist with this? Thank you, Vainant. Thank you, colleagues.
All right. Thank you. I think you're asking very pertinent questions as well. First of all, I did until quite recently serve on Wikipedia South Africa's advisory board as well. Well, actually on the board, not advisory board. I'm exceptionally fond of Wikipedia. Wikimedia. Wikimedia has got 14 projects, of which Wikipedia is one of them, but not for the reason to cite. I consider Wikipedia and all the other related entities as, first of all, a mechanism for linking information objects, data objects, but more importantly, also as a discovery layer. I would never ever cite Wikipedia, except if I'm doing a definition, for argument's sake, but definitely not in an article or thesis. And it's not that I question the integrity. In fact, Wikipedia has proven to be, how can I word this, to be incredible when it comes to public peer review processes. A lot of editing is happening all the time, which is brilliant. And if you go and check who's doing the editing and the level of citations they're putting in, and the incredible citation accuracy they're working with, that's something to be said about the free community working on producing research. But as I said, Wikipedia is a discovery layer. It's not a resource as an article. So I would rather use Wikipedia to find articles or to find materials in libraries or to link data elements, even use it for authority considerations in metadata creation. So that answers the first question. The second question, I think, related to theses and doctorals in the IRs. Remember that any research product, including theses and citations, are part of the image. That's the branding and the reputation of the institution. It should be checked. And it's normally checked by or supposedly to be checked by the supervisor, because it's a different kind of peer review process. If it's a master's level, and again, but let me give an example, using the same example as I did earlier on. If I'm an expert in my discipline and I supervise a master's student, and the master's student cited, and I cited an article, and the article is within Journal of Contemporary Management. I was, oh, this is great, good. Not realizing that there's a hijacked journal. There's another version out there. So that or even thesis and dissertation should be checked because it is part of the output of the institution. And it's a very visible output, unfortunately. And now you have to ask, not just do I trust my sources, but do I trust the sources of the people or students or scholars that I'm supervising? Because now my reputation is also underlined as a supervisor. At Rhodes, I don't know about other institutions, we actually add a supervisor to the metadata. So it's very clear. And if something is not correct in that thesis, it's not just the author or the creator, it's also the supervisor that will be questioned then. Then your question relating to who is supposed to do it. I think we're still finding our feet, and I think there's still being some institutions are more advanced than others in terms of research support and having the means and access and the money to do so. But that's why I want us to rather consider a community of practice to say, well, how do we establish best practices across institutions in South Africa, at least from a librarian perspective, and how can we then market this as part of the services rendered by the academic library to its community, scholarly community. But it's how can I don't know how to word this. We have a direct, if I consider Rhodes and our mandate, Rhodes focuses on 3 areas like any other institution. It's your research trajectory, it's your teaching trajectory, and your community enrichment or involvement processes. All divisions on campus actually are directly or indirectly involved in all of those. And part of our mandate, when we report on all of those. And maybe that's a good point or a good question from your side, because it makes us think in terms of, well, what is our role in this? Should we have a role? And would the academic community be open to having us assist them with this? And believe me, a supervisor or a student, last minute, they don't have time to do this either. That's why we need the tools, but we also need the expertise. And expertise being, we have to obviously have the knowledge, and not just knowledge of journals or articles, etc., how to find information, but a deep understanding of the whole scholarly communication environment.
Thanks so much, Vainan, for answering those questions. I'm just going to, I don't see any other hands up, but I just want to look quickly at the chat to see if there are any questions there. Yeah, I just commented in the chat that it's very worrying to, as you mentioned in your presentation, to realize that, the lists, like the DHET lists that we rely on, are not actually as reliable as we would hope them to be. And then, yeah, Cecilia just said, I feel like you went trying to sort out the baddies from the legitimate publishers when doing literature searches and searching for requested journals. The time to check thoroughly I don't have. Okay, I think she mentioned that, Cecilia, in her when she spoke just now. And then she just mentioned the GIF, Global Impact Factor, which is fake,
I question all impact factors. If there's citation cartels, and there's, sorry, I apologize, I interrupted. But we picked up that, I'm sure if anybody is published, so, the publisher will come back and say, all right, that's fine, we published this, but please also cite the following. And you wonder why, and you go back and say, well, it's all their own journals. It's a self-referencing, and then you have cartels on top of it, where people agree to cite each other, whether it's a scholarly community or whether it's publishers. And I think, well, this renders all kind of impact factors absolutely useless.
Yeah, no, it's it is. It's and then I just mentioned also, I find as a librarian in an academic institution, students, postgraduate students that we assist, tend to, until they've been educated, you know, in the use of our subscription or, you know, the databases that we subscribe to, tend to rely too much on things like Google Scholar, where there isn't peer review done, and a lot of articles there are from predatory or low quality journals. So yeah, and then of course, if they then cite those in their thesis or dissertation, it's you know, it's not a good practice there. Let's see, Cecilia just said, and absolutely, and copying the frequent bad referencing that's on it. So those articles from low quality journals would also, you know, have bad referencing often. And then, you know, then they're also making use of that. Yeah, Cecilia made a comment that almost without exception, Google Scholar upgrades master's theses to doctoral ones. Yeah, which I've also noticed. Okay, as Safiwa he or she had her hand up just now, but said in the chat, checking references is often done during the production process. I do not check references in any detail when I review, as long as the in-text citations are done correctly and I make the editors aware of this. I agree there are many mistakes on the reference lists, and theses and dissertations are worse with that.
That's, if I may respond to that, I think
sure.
It's great hearing from a person who's involved in the review process, saying that, well, I'll just look at the inline citation, if that's correct. I don't focus very much on the reference list itself. It's done as part of the rest of the editorial production process. And I am very deeply involved with the publication of a different journal at Rhodes. And it's the other way around, where the editor will say, well, look, I'm not, and the production, the layout editor, etc. We don't have the time, it's not our role. It's a reviewer's role to look at the references. So it's interesting to see the disparate, you know, the difference between the two approaches. Whether which one is right, I don't have an answer. I'm just pointing out that maybe one should ask those questions. I think it's a really good question.
Yeah. Thanks, Fernand. Yeah, Cecilia just said, my experience is that many students do not understand the scholarly process and environment. And then she said, I picked up an article on bad referencing by scholars. Yeah.
Maybe I can ask, is anybody here from University of Johannesburg? Nobody picking up. Actually, as a matter of interest, I ran a very prominent scholar at University of Johannesburg's article through Fidelio the other day, and I picked up referencing mistakes. And this is an extremely senior scholar. So I don't think it's just the students that's, you know, not understanding the environment. It is not just emerging scholars. It's actually even established scholars that we have to go back to. I see Debbie Martindale is Rhodes University's Digital Scholarship Unit. She's here. I know from, I don't know if Debbie, if I've missed it, but I don't know of any current support given for working through reference lists or literature reviews on behalf of scholars. But maybe what I'm asking for rather is I would very much like a national community of practice to be established where people can talk to each other and find out what is being done at the various institutions, what is meant by scholarly support, research support at our institutions, what's needed, what kind of skills do we need to look at. And it's all about introspection. It's about a changing environment. I mean, this is one thing I love about academic libraries, is that it's always changing. It's dynamic. But we have to stay on par. And the only thing we can really do is to talk to each other. And obviously share experiences from different environments. But Debbie, sorry, I don't want to put you on a spot. I don't know if Debbie is still here, she's gone. But I just want to ask, because Debbie's a colleague of mine. Debbie, do we actually do reference list checks for our researchers, whether they undergrad, postgrad, or academics?
Yeah, Wynand, hi everyone. When I was faculty librarian in the humanities section, yes, I was asked to do that quite a lot, and I'm guessing that that's still continuing as a practice. Yeah, but there's nothing formal. It's really ad hoc.
Thank you, Debbie. I think that's very important. This is the word ad hoc. So it was most probably then based on a relationship, or a person actually coming to the library and saying, look, I need assistance, or realizing that the library has a valuable role to play. And I'm sure it's going to be different from each institution. Students get very confused in this message with consistent referencing. I want to talk about sorry, this is now me going on a tangent. I have no idea why we have different referencing systems. Absolutely none. I can't understand why we can't just agree to one thing that can help all of us, instead of having different referencing systems, and not just different referencing systems. There's also different application of a referencing system. And then in certain cases, we will find that certain referencing systems will you have to use the full title. The next one, you have to use the ISO approved acronym. Another one is a MathSciNet acronym. Another one is a PubMed acronym. And I think, my gosh, no wonder we're in this mess. Of course, we're still clinging to eons of behaviors. Why not just go for a single approach? It'll help everybody, specifically now that research is so interdisciplinary. I'm just flabbergasted by our own abilities at times. So that's my question to the group. If anybody has given an answer to that, I would love to hear what it is.
Thanks, Wynand. Yeah, I was just typing in the chat. Yeah, as Cecilia mentioned about the different versions of Harvard, for example, you know, and yeah, it would, I think your suggestion is great, to have a standard format for referencing, and to just make people's lives a lot easier. Yeah, and like you said, also, you know, it's not just students that are not familiar with the scholarly environment and, you know, making these mistakes, but it's also established scholars. And the problem I found with, you know, at UNISA with researchers, when they get to a point of, for example, applying for NRF rating, it might be that they've written an article 10 years ago and the journal was absolutely fine and acceptable to publish in, but now, you know, it's perhaps listed as a, you know, dubious journal. So the situation changes so quickly, you know, over time, that it's sometimes difficult, I think, for scholars to keep up with this. That's just my input there. I just want to see if there's any, I don't think there's any other questions as such in the chat. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else you know, has any questions or comments, because we are now, I think, yes, we just 1 minute to go. So if there aren't any further, Wynand, do you have any further comment?
Well, I think from my side, one thing I would like to say is, first of all, I do apologize for the coughing in between. I tried my best to stifle it. I didn't realize I was this badly ill. I don't often speak that much. But thank you all for your presence, first of all, and for listening to me. And I think there's another things we need to take forward. And I hope that the RETIG group actually can identify. And I was wondering immediately whether RETIG, what is your, if I may ask, should RETIG not be the scholarly communication group? I'm just playing now on the words and the implications of the words that we use. Previously, and I'm talking now from my own ignorance, is that RETIG, well, I'm not doing research, I'm not going to join RETIG. Instead of thinking about it as research support, now we talk about scholarly communication, etc. What is the opportunity for RETIG to actually fill this sufficiently and strengthen the group by getting all scholarly communications on board and acting as the community of practice for all our institutions? That's just a comment or question from our side. But closing remarks from me, really thank you for this incredible opportunity, and do contact us if you need any more information about any of the products that I mentioned. But there's also a lot more I think that we can, from a librarian's perspective, we should need to talk about and discover amongst ourselves and ask the right questions. And it's we have to really become more embedded within the research. Well, actually, the whole scholarly ecosystem. We are not just a bystander, and we're definitely not innocent bystanders. We are active participants. Closing remark.
Thanks, Fernand. Yes, you've given us a lot to think about, not just for RETIG going forward, but also just for, for the library community and the scholarly community as a whole. But yeah, we will definitely talk further on this. And colleagues, those of you attending today, if you do have further questions that you would like to ask Fernand, as he said, you're welcome to communicate with him. And we will be sharing the recording and the presentation with all of you after the session. So yeah, it just leaves me to say a big thank you to you, Fernand, for making yourself available to do this presentation today. We really appreciate your inputs, and it's really been a wonderful webinar. So, and also thank you to Marupeni, my chair-elect of RETIG, for his, for sharing the platform with me in the beginning, and yeah, for his inputs. And yeah, and most of all, thank you, Kagiso from the Liasa office, for setting this up for us, and all your advice and assistance with the running of this webinar. So thank you everybody for attending, and yeah, and just have a good day further, and keep safe and keep warm wherever you are, and please join us for our next webinar or the webinars that follow during this year. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.